There are those that have their own motivations for critiquing. And, I think that the people are
Is it just
smarter.
racism and sexism? Like, what do you think it is?
I think there's a lot of things. I think it depends on who it's coming from. But I've been a black woman my whole life. So this idea that I'm gonna go and be like, oh, well, they're being racist or misogynistic towards me. Like, you think I didn't know I was a black woman when I woke up and decided that I was gonna run for the United States Senate?
Mm-hmm.
You think I didn't factor in and make sure that we had enough room to account for that?
What's up, family? So buckle up because this is where Democrats might just have stepped on their own rake and smacked themselves in the face. And if you don't even follow politics like that, don't worry because I'm gonna break this all the way down in regular human language and plain English so it makes sense. Because what we're looking at right now is the bombshell poll that could spell straight up disaster for Democrats who have been dreaming about flipping Texas from red to blue in the United States Senate. And before we even go further, let me explain what that means because some of y'all here flip a red seat and think it's some secret political code, and it's not really that complicated at all because the Senate is basically one of the two big chambers in Congress where laws get passed. Every state gets two senators, and even when we say a state is red, that means Republicans usually win there. And when we say it's blue, that means Democrats usually win there. And Texas has been red for decades, meaning Republicans dominate statewide elections. So when Democrats say they want to flip Texas blue, they're saying they want to take a seat Republicans normally win and turn it into a Democrat win. That's the goal, that's the dream, that's the strategy because control of the Senate nationally can come down to literally one or two seats. So Texas is like a big prize on a chessboard. And here's where it gets messy because before Democrats can even try to beat the Republican in the general election, which is the final round where everybody goes or everybody votes, I should say, they have to fight each other in what's called a primary. And a primary is basically the party's internal tryout, right? Like imagine a team holding auditions before the championship game. So you just don't walk onto the court. You have to beat your own teammates first. And right now in Texas, you got Jasmine Crockett and James Talarico in an absolute slugfest trying to become the Democrat nominee. And when I say slugfest, I mean it's not polite disagreement. It's gloves off because Jasmine Crockett's camp has accused James Talarico of racism. And that's not a light accusation. That's not, oh, he disagrees with me on taxes. That's nuclear level in Democrat politics because the Democratic base, meaning the most loyal voters in that party, takes racial issues extremely seriously. So the allegation comes from a Crockett supporter claiming that behind closed doors, Talarico referred to Colin Aldred, a black Democrat who previously ran for Senate as a mediocre black man, quote unquote. And whether that was said or not, whether it was taken out of context or not, once that accusation is out there, it changes the whole energy of the race because now it's not just political or policy differences at that point, I should say. Now it's character assassination. Now it's morality. Now it's, oh, you're secretly racist. And in a Democrat primary, that's like throwing gasoline on a fire because primaries are not about convincing Republicans. They're about convincing the most, how can I put this? The most ideological or ideologically committed Democrats. And those voters are more likely to react strongly to accusations involving race. So when people say the race card was pulled, what they mean in plain words is that race was introduced as a central issue in a way that could damage the opponent emotionally and morally rather than just politically. And it's like instead of arguing about who has the better economic plan, you're arguing about whether someone is fundamentally a bad person. And here's where it gets interesting because before all of this, James Talarico was leading. He had momentum. He was seen as more moderate, more polished, maybe more electable statewide. But now and after this controversy, Jasmine Crockett has reportedly taken a surprise lead in the polls, and that tells you something about how Democrat primary voters might be reacting to these accusations. And this is where the bigger strategic problem comes in because inside political parties, you have voters and you have strategists, and they don't always think the same way. Voters vote with emotion, values, identity, energy, but strategists, the consultants, the data nerds, the people looking at county maps, they think about math. They think about turnout models. They think about suburban swing voters. And from a strategist perspective, the goal isn't just to win the primary, it's to win the general election in a red state like Texas. And that's a whole different battlefield, because the general election includes independents, moderates, and even some soft Republicans, not just hardcore Democrats. So while Crockett might be gaining traction in the primary, which is her basically being a top pick to represent the Democrat Party that they chose to obviously run against the Republican to win the general election. That's basically what the primary is, amongst the party, amongst themselves, seeing who has the best fit, even though there's maybe 3 or more candidates who feel like running. But eventually it's going to come down to within that party who is going to be the candidate ultimately that's going to be the person to represent that party, right? So Crockett might be gaining traction in the primary by leaning into a strong rhetoric and controversy. Party strategists might be quietly panicking, thinking, okay, but can she win statewide against a Republican in Texas? Because Texas isn't California. It's not New York. It's a state where Republicans still have structural advantages. Rural counties dominate, from a geographic standpoint, or geographically, turnout patterns lead red, and messaging that works in a primary can backfire in a general election. It's like training for a street fight and then stepping into a boxing ring with different rules. And this is why some Democrats might secretly prefer Talarico, because he may be viewed as more moderate, more how can I put this? More palatable, or yeah, more how can I put this? More intriguing or more interesting to suburban voters. Less controversial, more capable of pulling crossover support. And if your ultimate goal is flipping that Senate seat, you don't just pick who fires up Twitter, as we know that, as you guys just seen in this first clip I showed you. Jasmine Crockett tends to be very divisive, and suburban voters are not going to go for that crap. She thinks just because she can say I'm a strong black woman that they're just going to gain her voters, and nobody wants to sit there and vote for somebody that's continue to use their race as a way to think they're going to win elections instead of lobbying the best interest for their supporters, their constituents. And that's why I say Talarico would be more preferred when it comes to suburban voters, and not Jasmine Crockett, who fires up Twitter, because you pick who can win 51% of Texas voters in November. And that's the tension here, because Crockett winning a primary might energize a certain wing of the base, but could make the general election harder, right? And if Democrats lose the general, all that internal infighting within the Democrat Party to see who's going to ultimately represent and the person that's best fit, if none of the other individuals within the Democrat Party can't be the top runner to run in the general election against a Republican, um, look, man, this can get very the internal fighting was for nothing, which then they just handed Republicans the seat again. And that's why this poll is being called a bombshell, not just because Crockett is leading, but because it signals that the Democratic base might be moving in a direction that complicates the broader strategy of flipping Texas. And the worst part for Democrats is that public infighting weakens the brand overall, because when voters see a party accusing its own members of racism, throwing dirt, leaking alleged private comments, it doesn't scream unity, it screams chaos. And chaos is not usually the image you want when you're trying to convince moderate voters that you're stable enough to govern. So this isn't just about one comment or one poll. This is about whether Democrats can balance primary passion with the general election practicality. Rather, emotional energy is going to override cold strategy, and rather, pulling a race card in a primary helps you win the nomination, but hurts you when it's time to face the Republican machine in a state that historically leans red. And if you don't follow politics closely, just understand it like this: Imagine you are trying to win a championship game, but before you even get there, your team is fighting in the locker room, calling each other names, questioning each other's character. And by the time you step on the court, you're bruised, you're divided, and exhausted. And that's what this looks like, right? And in a state like Texas, where the margin for Democrats is already thin, that kind of internal war could be the difference between finally flipping that seat blue or watching another Republican senator get sworn in while Democrats sit there wondering how their hopes and dreams fell apart before the real fight even started. And I pray that the Republicans stay in control over there in Texas. Good old Texas, right? So I wanted to break that down because not only did I wanted to give you the context, but I want you guys to check out James Carville. He is the Democrat strategist who I said, and when it comes to data and numbers and see who has the potential to, when it comes to the Democrat Party side, because he's pro-Democrat, he supports Democrat, he's a hardcore Democrat. He is going to break down his input strategically when it comes to the best interest of Democrats to win the general election to flip, Texas blue. Check it out.
Crockett has said that Hispanics who voted for Trump have a slave mentality. That's not very smart. That will bite you in the ass in a general election. Furthermore, in anybody that has any sense of humanity, she made fun of Greg Abbott, who is a comical figure, but not because he's a comical figure, an intellectual goat, that he was actually in a wheelchair. That's not right. Come on, lady. That's just trying to do some online fundraising with some Seattle fanatic progressives. And I'm for Jim Talarico. I think Jim's a great guy and about all of that. But basically, I would be for anybody that I thought had the best chance of winning. And it's clear to me that Jim would have a much, much better chance of winning the general election than Jasmine Crockett. I don't think that's a bad person. And by the way, I don't think there's much difference in how they would vote. I don't think you can get much different product. But if you don't win, you hadn't done shit. So if you want to win the election, if that's important to you, as it is to me, then you got to be for Jim Talarico. It's that simple.
Well, I agree, but I want to, I want Mr. Talarico to come on this program. He has ducked us a couple times.
He's coming out. I don't have any doubt.
And so I share your assessment.
And now that you guys heard that, the strategist for the Democrat Party, James Carville, I really want y'all to see right here, and really want y'all to understand why this right here is what you call a dream scenario for Republicans and a straight up nightmare for Democrats. And I'm not saying that as hype. I'm saying that strategically, politically, mathematically, this is exactly how the game works. So boom, here's the situation. Republicans are sitting back watching this Democrat Party, right? Democrat primary between Jasmine Crockett and James Talarico. And if you're a Republican strategist, you're probably thinking, please let Crockett win. And then you might be thinking, why would the opposing party want the more aggressive candidate to win? Wouldn't you want the weaker one out? And that's where you have to understand the difference between winning a primary and winning a general election, right? Because they are not the same battlefield. They are two completely different arenas. It's like winning a rap battle in your neighborhood versus trying to go platinum nationally, different audiences, different expectations, different energy. And what James Carville, who, by the way, is a longtime Democrat strategist that I told you guys that we just listened to, meaning he's one of the political brains behind campaign strategy, basically admitted is that Jasmine Crockett would be a weak general election candidate in Texas. And that matters because Texas is what we call a red state, which means Republicans consistently win statewide races there, like I've said. And that's not opinion, that's voting history. And when you're running in a red state, you either have to pull over independents, which are voters not firmly loyal to either party, or you have to flip some moderate Republicans. And that requires a certain tone, a certain messaging style, a certain level of broad appeal. And this is where the criticism of Crockett comes in, because she's viewed as far left, especially on cultural and racial issues. And let me break that down because far left gets thrown around like a buzzword nowadays. When people say far left, they usually mean strong progressive positions on things like systemic racism, identity politics, government intervention, social justice activism, and aggressive rhetoric towards conservative structures. And for Democrat primary voters, that can be energizing, that can feel bold, that can feel like finally somebody is fighting. But for general election voters in a red state like Texas, that same energy can feel extreme, polarizing, or even alienating, depending on who's listening. And the politics is about addition, not just intensity. You don't just need loud supporters, you need enough total votes. And here's the key point that a lot of people miss. You can motivate your base and still lose if you motivate the other side even more. And that's the gamble with someone like Jasmine Crockett. Because yes, she might energize progressive Democrats. She might get people fired up. She might dominate social media clips. But at the same time, she could just easily fire up conservatives who otherwise might have stayed home. She becomes a lightning rod. And a lightning rod attracts energy from both sides. And in Texas, where Republicans already have structural advantages in rural counties and turnout models, firing up the opposition can be deadly. Now, compare that to someone like James Talarico, who is also left leaning policy wise. Let's not pretend he's a moderate conservative Democrat. He's still progressive on a lot of issues, but the difference critics are pointing to is tone and perception. He's viewed as less divisive, less confrontational, less culturally inflammatory. And in a general election, perception matters more than ideology details because most general election voters are not reading policy white papers. They are reacting to the vibe, the temperament, and whether you feel reasonable or extreme. And when people throw around terms like cultural Marxists and attacks against Crockett, what they're trying to signal is that she focused heavily on cultural power structures, race narratives, and systemic critiques of American institutions. Whether that label is fair or exaggerated is a separate debate, but politically, what matters is how that label lands with swing voters. Because if enough moderates in suburbs around Dallas, Houston, or Austin hear that framing and feel uncomfortable, that's votes lost. And this is exactly why Republicans would prefer to face Jasmine Crockett, right? Because campaigns are contrast machines. You want the clearest contrast that benefits you. And if they can frame her as extreme while presenting their candidate as stability, law and order, pro-business Texas traditionalism, that's a fight they feel confident in. Meanwhile, Democrats are stuck in a dilemma because primary voters often reward passion and ideological purity, while general elections reward coalition, building, and persuasion. And those two things don't always align. It's like choosing between a teammate who hypes up the locker room versus the one who quietly wins you the game. And if this new poll shows Crockett gaining ground, that signals the base may be prioritizing passion over electability. And that's why this is being described as not good news for Democrats, because internally they might be thinking, are we about to nominate someone who excites Twitter but loses Texas? And remember, in a red state, you can't afford to just break even with independents. You have to overperform expectations. You have to chip away at the Republican advantage. And if your candidate is someone who energizes as many opponents as supporters, the math becomes brutal. So when I say this is a dream scenario for Republicans, what I mean is they don't even have to interfere. They just have to watch Democrats potentially choose the candidate they believe is easier to beat. And when I say it's a nightmare for Democrats, it's because they're stuck between ideological momentum and strategic survival. And if they get this wrong, all those hopes of flipping that Senate seat blue, which I pray it doesn't happen, could collapse before they even get to the real fight in November in the general election. And that's why this poll matters, because it's not just numbers on a page. It's a signal about direction, and direction in politics can decide who controls power nationally, not just in Texas, but in Washington as a whole. So now I want you guys to check this out in regards to the polls.
Well, we are a little more than 1 week away from the start of early voting in the March primary elections.
The new polling is offering new insights into Texas's competitive U.S. Senate race. It shows Republican Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton and Democratic U.S. Representative Jasmine Crockett leading their respective primary races.
KVU's Daniel Perot is here with a closer look at the poll and the state of the race as Texans get ready to start voting. Daniel?
Yeah, that new polling was conducted late last month by the University of Houston's Hobby School of Public Affairs. It surveyed 550 likely Democrat and Republican primary voters. It showed that Ken Paxton is leading the incumbent Senator John Cornyn by 7 points and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett ahead of State Representative James Talarico by 8 points. Both of those are outside the margin of error. It is interesting because some other recent polls have had both those races as neck and neck. For candidates and campaigns, it's the home stretch before early voting.
You only have about a week left to make sure that you can reach all of those voters.
A new survey of likely primary voters by the University of Houston shows Attorney General Ken Paxton leading Senator John Cornyn 38-31, with Wesley Hunt in a distant third place at 17%. 12% are not decided.
It's a virtual certainty that we're going to have a runoff in the Republican U.S. Senate primary. The only question is, who are the two people in that runoff?
According to the survey, Paxton has an advantage in a runoff. More than half of Republican primary voters say an endorsement by President Trump would make them more likely to support a candidate. So far, he's stayed out of the race.
He could, if he wanted to, boost Hunt into that runoff and particularly into the Senate.
On the other side, 47% of likely Democratic primary voters say they support Jasmine Crockett over James Talarico. Crockett led Talarico in most key demographic groups, except for white voters and those who have an advanced degree.
Overwhelming majority of African American voters intend to vote for her, and they intend to turn out to vote in larger numbers than normal for a Democratic primary.
In the survey, Crockett has a 7-point lead among Latino voters overall and a 20-point lead among Latino women, while Talarico has a 6-point lead among Latino men.
We're in the Democratic primary where 60% are women and 40% are men.
In a head-to-head general election matchup, both Paxton and Cornyn polled ahead of Crockett by 2 points. Paxton is slightly better than Cornyn against Talarico. Hunt has the largest margin, leading Talarico by 4 points.
Right now, at least in the U.S. Senate race, it's a coin flip.
For Republicans, the gloves are off with attack ads. Experts say that has given voters overall more negative opinions on the three candidates.
And while Wesley Hunt is significantly behind Cornyn, the Paxton campaign wants to make sure that he doesn't somehow catch up.
And there you have it, family.
50% of Texas.
There you have it. So this is where the numbers start telling a deeper story. And I need y'all to really understand how polling works and why the shift matters, because what we're seeing is earlier polls had Talarico beating Jasmine Crockett. And meaning he had the edge. He had the momentum. He looked like the safer bet in the Democrat primary. And now suddenly a new poll drops showing Crockett, right? As you guys can see here, showing Crockett ahead. Let me get it. Where is that? Here you go. Showing Crockett ahead. So it tells you one thing immediately. This race is tight, like actually competitive. Not a landslide, not a blowout, but neck and neck. And in politics, when you see polls swinging back and forth like that, it usually means voter opinion is not locked in. It means people are still deciding. It means messaging is working on some level. And it also means attacks are landing somewhere. And let me explain polling in the basic, simplistic terms, right? Because a lot of people hear poll and they think it's some crystal ball prediction machine. It's not. A poll, when it comes to it, is a snapshot in time where a company calls or surveys a sample of voters and asks who they support, and that's it. It's like taking a picture of a race while the runners are still moving. It doesn't guarantee who's going to win, is my point. It just tells you where the people lean at that moment. So when you see Talarico leading in one poll and Crockett leading in another, what that really signals is, how can I put this? Volatility. Meaning the race can go either way, depending on turnout, messaging, debates, and momentum. And here's why that matters strategically, because Crockett was the favorite coming into this race. She had the name recognition. She had the media attention. She was expecting to dominate, meaning the expectation was what she would basically blow Talarico out of the water. And when you expect it, you are the expected winner, but you're locked in a tight race. That's not strength, that's vulnerability, because it means your dominance isn't guaranteed. It means your base might not be as unified as people thought, or even Jasmine Crockett thought. And if you're Democrats looking at this from a 10,000-foot view, this tight race creates two problems at the same time. First, it prolongs internal division, because a close primary usually means more negative campaigning, more accusations, more mudslinging. And we already saw race allegations enter the chat here from James Crockett. Jasmine Crockett, not James Crockett. Jasmine Crockett basically accusing James Talarico, and they both from the same party, of being racist, right? So I want to put that out there. So you got the race allegations entering the chat. And if this thing stays tight, expect more hits, more desperation to basically take place, and more attempts to define the opponent before they define you. And second, it drains resources, because when candidates are fighting hard in a primary, they are spending money, time, and political capital attacking each other instead of preparing for the Republican in the general election. It's like two teammates boxing each other before the championship game, showing up bruised. And the reason the new poll is not good news for Democrats isn't just about who's up 2 or 3 points. It's about what it implies. It implies uncertainty. It implies internal friction between the Democrat Party, as you guys can see with the race accusation. And it implies that the party might not get the clean, unified transition they need heading into a general election in a red state like Texas. Because remember, Texas is not forgiving territory for Democrats. If you don't get to make a bunch of mistakes and still win comfortably, you have to execute almost perfectly. And if your primary is messy, tight, and polarizing, that means that makes that job harder. And on top of that, when expectations don't match reality, donors and strategists get nervous, because if Crockett was supposed to dominate, she's basically scrambling and scraping, or trading leads, and that signals weakness to people watching from the outside, including Republicans, who are calculating their attack ads as we speak. And politics is perception as much as policy. And if the perception becomes that Democrats are divided, uncertain, and nominating someone through a bruising fight instead of a confident wave, that shapes how voters see the whole party. So when we zoom out between James Talarico and Jasmine Crockett, this isn't just about one poll flipping. It's about momentum swinging and expectations being challenged, and a realization that this primary is not the easy coordination some people thought it would be. And in a state where Democrats already face an uphill battle, a tight, messy, unpredictable primary is not exactly the launch pad you'll design if your goal was flipping Texas blue. And that's why, again, from a strategic lens, this development is more stressful for Democrats than it is exciting, because tight races inside the party can energize supporters, sure, but they can also expose cracks that the other side is more than happy to exploit once the real fight begins. So that's my whole point with that, when you guys see that. So now, as you guys see this, because it says, this is basically the poll asking about 6 potential general election scenarios. How would Jasmine Crockett, James Talarico fare in general election? The red leaning Texas becomes Senate battleground. Democrats have their eyes on Texas for years and hopes blue shift in suburban areas can make the state more competitive at the presidential level. That did play out throughout the 2010s. Republican margins shrunk from nearly 16 points in 2012 to 9 points in 2016 to under 6 points in 2020, right? So now I want to get to the Republican side, right? Because now I have to talk about the Republican Party. These 3 gentlemen, Cornyn, Hunt, Paxton. because this is where the chess match gets even more interesting. And I need you to understand something very clearly. Both parties are not just trying to win, they're trying to pick the matchup that gives them the best odds. This is like boxing promoters trying to line up the right opponent. So before we even talk about Democrats again, let's explain what's happening on the Republican side in simple terms. Because over here with the Republicans, you got multiple candidates running, and the two big names are John Cornyn and Ken Paxton. And the way Republican primaries work in Texas, the two big names are, like I said, John Cornyn and Ken Paxton. And this is important, right? Because as if no candidate gets over 50% of the vote, meaning the actual majority, not just the most votes, but more than half, then the race doesn't end. It goes to what's called a runoff. And a runoff is basically overtime. It's like nobody scored enough to win outright. So the top two candidates face each other in a one-on-one in the second round, which in this case will be John Cornyn and Ken Paxton. John Cornyn has 31%, Paxton has 38%. And what you see right here is it looks like nobody's going to hit that 50% threshold, which means we're likely toward a Cornyn versus Paxton runoff. And here's where the math gets spicy, because Wesley Hunt in the middle here with the 17%, sitting around 17% in some polling, and there's about 12% undecided voters. And those two chunks of voters are basically the swing block that could decide who survives the runoff between John Cornyn and Ken Paxton. So the real question becomes, where do those voters go? Do Hunt supporters lean more towards Paxton or Cornyn? Do undecideds break toward the more establishment candidate or the more MAGA aligned candidate? And when people say Paxton is seen as the more MAGA guy, right? Make America Great Again guy. What they mean is he aligns more closely with the Trump style Republican politics, more aggressive, more confrontational, more populist energy, whereas Cornyn is viewed as a more establishment Republican, meaning he's been in Washington a long time. He represents the traditional GOP structure, potentially the rhino GOP structure, the dinosaurs within that party, less flashy, more institutional. And Democrats are looking at that matchup and thinking strategically, not emotionally, strategically, because they're saying, okay, if we had to choose which Republican we'd rather face in the general election, who gives us better odds? And according to some Democrat strategists, they believe Ken Paxton is more beatable than Cornyn, meaning they think his baggage, controversies, and strong MAGA brand that might turn off enough moderate voters in a statewide election to create an opening. So from the Democrat perspective, the ideal scenario statistically would be Paxton winning on the Republican side and James Talarico winning on the Democrat side, because Talarico is viewed more as a, I'm gonna put this, palatable and or interesting and more receptive and more, gravitated towards in a general election. And Paxton is viewed as more polarizing. So that combination, Paxton versus Talarico, is what some Democrats probably see as their best case matchup for flipping the seat. But here's where it all collides, because if Paxton wins the Republican runoff, which polls suggest he may have the edge in, and at the same time Jasmine Crockett wins the Democrat primary instead of Talarico, then the strategic advantage Democrats thought they had shrinks dramatically. Because now, instead of running a more moderate, broadly appealing Democrat against a controversial Republican, you're running a polarizing Democrat against a polarizing Republican in a red state. And in Texas, that math is risky for Democrats, because even if Paxton is controversial, he still benefits from the Republican baseline advantage in a state that historically leans red. And if Crockett is also seen as divisive, especially on cultural and racial issues, then instead of expanding the battlefield for Democrats, you're basically canceling out the advantage they hope to exploit. And this is why I keep saying politics is about matchups. It's not just about who you like more personally. It's about the pieces, how the pieces line up on the board. And Democrats' dream scenario is Paxton versus Talarico. Republicans' dream scenario might be Paxton versus Crockett, because in that situation, Republicans can argue that even if Paxton has baggage, Texas voters would still prefer him over someone they view as far left or culturally extreme and divisive. And here's the brutal truth Democrats have to wrestle with. If Jasmine Crockett is the nominee in a red state like Texas, it's going to be really, really, really tough, regardless of whether she faces Cornyn or Paxton, because statewide elections are about coalition building. And if your brand energizes as many opponents as supporters, especially in a state where the other party already has a structural edge, the climb becomes steep. So when you zoom all the way out and look at both primaries happening at the same time, what you see is a complicated political chess match where each party is secretly hoping the other nominates. Each party secretly hoping the other one nominates the candidate they believe is the easiest to beat. And if the matchups don't line up the way Democrats are hoping, meaning if Paxton wins on the right and Crockett wins on the left, then the advantage Democrats thought they had against Paxton could evaporate. Because instead of presenting a contrast between controversial Republican and measured Democrat, you'll have a high intensity cultural war election in a state that historically leans Republican. And that's why all these polls, all these percentages that you guys see on the screen, even from Newsweek that I showed you right here, all these percentages, all these runoff rules actually matter, because they determine not just who advances, but what the battlefield looks like in November. And in Texas, the battlefield itself can decide the war. So I wanted to put that out there. Now, this is where it all comes together. And I need you to really lock in, because the numbers don't lie even when people try to spin them. So when you actually look at the head-to-head matchups, meaning if the election were held today, the general election, and if it was Republican versus Democrat straight up, what the polls are showing is that Republicans have the edge regardless of who the Democrat nominee is. And that's the key point. That's the headline. That's the reality check. Because when Paxton is matched up against Crockett, he's up 2 points. And when he's matched up against Talarico, he's up 2 points. When Cornyn is matched up against Crockett, he's up 2 points. Against Talarico, he's up 1, Paxton. When Hunt is matched up, he's leading by even more. And what that tells you, no matter how you shuffle the deck, Republicans are still slightly ahead in a red state like Texas. Slightly ahead. I'm going to quote that again. Is a big deal, because here's something people who don't follow politics closely need to understand. Polls in Texas historically tend to underestimate Republican performance. Meaning, when election day actually comes and the real votes are counted, Republicans often outperform what the polls predicted. So if a poll shows a Republican up by 2, historically that could translate into a slightly larger margin in reality. And now that's not a guarantee, but it's a trend that political analysts watch closely. So when you see Republicans leaning in what could be considered a worst case polling scenario for them, that's not comforting if you're a Democrat trying to flip the seat. That's like being down on the scoreboard before the game even really starts. And knowing the other team usually plays better in the fourth quarter. And then when you compare Crockett and Talarico directly, what the data suggests is that Crockett performs slightly worse in these general election matchups than Talarico does. And we're not talking about massive gaps, but in tight statewide races, 1 or 2 points is the difference between victory and concession speech. And that goes back to the electability argument we've been breaking down this whole time in this video. And give this video a big thumbs up if you get some value from this video and you got this far in the video. And if you're new to the family, subscribe to the channel. If you're already rocking with me and subscribe and part of the family, I appreciate you for rocking with me. But what I'm saying is, if Democrats are trying to choose the candidate, if I'm breaking this down this whole time, because if Democrats are trying to choose the candidate who gives them the absolute best statistical chance of flipping a red seat, the numbers are hinting that Talarico might perform marginally better in a general election than Crockett. And again, this isn't about personal preference. It's about math, because flipping a seat in a red state requires squeezing every possible independent and moderate vote you can get. You can't afford to lose even small silvers of persuadable voters. And if the polling shows one candidate consistently trailing by slightly more, that becomes a strategic concern. And when you zoom out and look at the whole board, Republicans have the structural advantage. They have the historical trend advantage. And based on these matchups, they are also currently having a polling advantage. which is why this is being framed as not good news for Democrats. I keep saying, because even in the best theoretical pairing, they're still trailing, and that means the climb is steep no matter what. And then to add another layer of drama on top of all of this, you got The View, right? With the lunch ladies, Whoopi Goldberg, that crew being investigated over an interview with James Talarico, just to add to Jasmine Crockett accusing her own friend, part of her own party, of the Democrat Party, and calling her racist. Now you have The View being investigated over an interview with James Talarico because the FCC, which stands for the Federal Communications Commission, basically the federal agency that regulates broadcast television and radio, is looking at whether the show violated something called the Equal Time Rule. And I want to break that down super simple. The Equal Time Rule, before we get to the video, and I want to show you guys the context to it, and then I'll close out, is that it says that if a broadcast station gives airtime to one legally qualified candidate, in this case, James Talarico is a Democrat, for public office, they have to offer equal opportunity to the other candidates for that same office. It's about fairness in media across during campaigns. So if The View gave Talarico a platform and interviewed him and brought him on the show, because we know ABC, the mainstream liberal media, is part of one of them networks, along with CNN and MSNBC, and now known as MS Now. They didn't offer similar opportunity to his opponents, in this case, the Republicans, when it comes to Ken Paxton and John Cornyn and, Hunt. So when you look at that, right, that could raise questions under that rule, because now investigations don't automatically mean guilt. It just means regulators are examining whether proper procedures were followed. But politically, it adds another headline, another distraction, and another narrative layer in an already chaotic race. And all of this together paints a picture of high stakes Senate battle where Democrats are fighting internally, Republicans are calculating matchups, polls are showing that the Republican Party, the GOP advantages across the board, and even media appearances are now being scrutinized, is my point. Because we know that the lunch ladies on The View, they are pro-Democrat. Check this out.
The View is reportedly under scrutiny from the Trump administration this morning after an interview with Texas Senate candidate James Talarico.
Reuters reports over the weekend that the Federal Communications Commission is investigating whether the popular daytime talk show broke the rules for equal time when they were interviewing Talarico and not giving the same opportunity to his opponents. This comes after the agency extended the rule for equal time late last month to some late night and daytime talk show hosts, which were previously exempt. Under that exemption, bona fide news programming doesn't require equal time, and talk shows have argued in the past that their interview segments fell under the same category. The FCC pulled many of those exemptions last month, a change that was highly criticized by some in that sphere, including Stephen Colbert and also Jimmy Kimmel, both of whom were targeted by the president's administration in the past. Take a listen.
Minions at the FCC are planning to make it difficult for shows like ours and The View to interview politicians they don't align with. For real, we are once again getting threatened by the FCC.
This is clearly an attempt to silence me, Jimmy, and Seth, and I've got to say one thing to the FCC. Hey, I'm flattered you think that appearing on my show has the power to affect politics in any way.
But FCC Chair Brendan Carr pushed back, saying that he's just enforcing a rule already on the books.
That exception has come to swallow the rule, principally because there was a handful of FCC decisions from many, many years ago that have been overread by TV broadcasters to assume that every single program, including all late-night TV, all daytime TV, is necessarily now a bona fide news program. And we're simply reminding people that, in fact, that's not the case.
In response to the new investigation into The View, FCC Commissioner Ana Gomez slammed the decision, saying in a statement, quote, like many other so-called investigations, before it, the FCC will announce an investigation but never carry one out, reach a conclusion, or take any meaningful action. This is government intimidation, not a legitimate investigation. It's important to note The View did interview one of Talarico's opponents last month, fellow Democrat Jasmine Crockett. However, her interview came before the FCC's policy change. If the FCC rules against The View after this investigation, several other candidates for Texas Senate may be entitled to airtime on The View, including incumbent Senator John Cornyn and Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. I mean, The View has long time, since 2014, actually operated as news adjacent, which makes it exempt to like the Section 315 that they're talking about. So for him to change it in January, now saying they need to provide equal time. I mean, they talked to Jasmine Crockett about a variety of things outside of her run, but if we're looking specifically at the Talarico interview, they talked to him, and I watched it about his faith, his family. So it's not all about the election and how he plans on winning. It's a national news show that doesn't have to balance it out every time and bring a competitor on. They bring the people that are most relevant to today's news. So Marjorie Taylor Greene was on after she began a tirade against the president during a contentious healthcare battle and jumped on the side of Democrats, which was newsworthy because everybody and their mother was reporting on it. Talarico is relevant news right now because he started beating Jasmine Crockett in polls, and people were not even knowing if a Democrat could actually swing the state. So he might be one of the first Democrats to actually break through in Texas. That is a big deal. I think they're talking about newsworthy people. So if you want them to bring everybody on to balance it out, it's like, not, what are we talking about?
No, it's not, you have to bring it. I mean, the equal time rule is that if you, and it doesn't matter what you're interviewing them about, but you're presenting this figure to the public, then you have to give some measure of equal time to their opponents. Now, a couple complicating things. Right now, we're still in the primary phase. They did talk to both Jasmine Crockett and James Talarico. That's in the Democratic primary. So if The View subsequently interviewed whoever the Republican candidate ends up being and whoever that would seem to me to be fine if we're being reasonable. Also, I frankly think the equal time rule is stupid and should be repealed entirely, so I don't really care if it's enforced. This is from
It's not stupid, and that's where he's ignorant. Because the simple fact is, you can't sit there and have one party on being nationally televised on ABC when it comes to sitting with these lunch ladies right here, and then don't have the other party. Because it's the same reason why we're fighting for the SAVE Act, right? For general and fair elections. For the simple fact that elections have been rigged, and all that the SAVE Act is asking for fair visibility amongst both parties. How is that hard? The same thing with the SAVE Act that just got passed from the House today. I pray to God that it get passed to the Senate and then it reaches President Trump's desk so he can sign it. The same way we have a license to drive, a license to drink. We have to prove our identification to make sure that we legally and we can be identified even when we get pulled over with law enforcement, so we're recognized, right? The simple fact is, it's just responsibility. I mean, I don't know who don't walk around with their license. So the simple fact to make the SAVE Act in this case with the FCC to try to make it the government is attacking us and the Donald Trump is weaponizing the Department of Justice against news networks and the FCC. They have changed the rule to where now that you have to give equal visibility, and it's stupid when it's really not, because that's the whole point of equal time, right? And equal opportunity. That's all Donald Trump is asking for fairness amongst our elections, fairness amongst visibility, so the voters can decide. And at the end of the day, when you're looking at it, right, James Talarico is actively running for office. That's the key. He's not just some random political commentary. He's a candidate in a live election, even though it's still the Democrat primary, like he said. But once you are a legally qualified candidate, certain federal broadcast rule kicks in. Specifically, like I said, the equal time rule. And when you look at the equal time rule from a licensed broadcast station, and then you have a channel that operates on public airways regulated by a government like ABC, which these lunch ladies on the screen from The View are obviously employed by, giving airtime to one candidate for office, they should have given equal opportunity and at least offer. And now, if the Republicans, when it comes to Ken Paxton and John Cornyn and Hunt, if they deny, then that's one thing. But they never offer, because we know that they're a pro-Democrat leaning network when it comes to ABC and The View specifically, right? They always just interview and bring up Democrat politicians only. So it's about fairness and access, because the airways technically belong to the public, not just the network. So the government says if you're using public airways to give one political candidate exposure, You can't just slam the door on their opponent. Now, here's where it gets tricky and where people get confused, because shows like The View say we are a talk show, right? But then they lean into the entertainment angle, the opinion angle, the daytime panel vibe. But at the end of the day, they air on ABC, which is a licensed broadcast network. And that means certain FCC rules can apply depending on the context of the appearance. Now, historically, there are exemptions for bona fide news programs, meaning if a candidate appears in a legitimate news interview, that doesn't always trigger equal time obligations in the same way as pure campaign style promotion would. But if regulators determine that the appearance was effectively giving one candidate promotional exposure to raise one candidate up, and an active race, then opponents can argue they deserve equal opportunity. And that's the heart of this issue. It's not about silencing anybody. It's about rather one candidate was given a platform that the others weren't offered. And if this FCC decides to strictly enforce the rule, then yes, technically Republicans are opposing Democrats, and that same race could argue they're entitled to similar airtime. And this is where the political narrative kicks in, because critics of The View argue that the show has increasingly functioned as a friendly platform for Democrats, like I've said, meaning Democrat candidates often appear in a supportive environment rather than a hostile cross-examination. And from that perspective, people are saying, okay, if you're going to operate like news adjacent platform on a major network and invite active candidates on during the election cycle, then you shouldn't be surprised if regulators say, fine, but open the door to the other side too. I think that's common sense, and supporters of enforcement will frame it as accountability, not censorship. They'll say it's about preventing one-sided political promotion on public airways, while critics of enforcement might argue that not every candidate is equally newsworthy. And this is where the newsworthiness exemption becomes a debate, because the rule is the damn rule, right? The rule doesn't mean a network has to invite literally every single fringe candidate who files paperwork. There's nuance. But the tension comes when the line between the news interview and political platform gets blurry. And let's be honest, perception matters here. And if viewers believe The View overwhelmingly promotes one party's candidate and rarely gives serious airtime to the opposition, then politically it fuels the argument that equal time should be applied more aggressively. And the Marjorie Taylor Greene thing that he mentioned, example, gets brought up because critics say she was only welcome, to be honest, truthfully, in a specific context that fits the show's narrative, not as a neutral, balanced gesture, right? Because she wouldn't have been on The View if she was still rocking with Donald Trump. Once Marjorie Taylor Greene tried to go against Donald Trump and trash Donald Trump, when she was rocking with him and she was on the Republican side, until she decided to flip, or whatever the case may be. That's the only reason why The View brought her on, because it was basically headlines and drama to go against Donald Trump, which we know that Whoopi Goldberg, Sonny Houston hate Donald Trump, and The View specifically are Democrat, predominantly Democrat, pro-Democrat supporters, right? So that's just what it is. And when you look at the whole thing, it all comes down to one simple principle. Public airwaves come with public obligations. And once someone is officially running for office, the rules change, damn it. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Appreciate you for rocking with me. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.